All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Basu and Godin Notebook on this Monday, March the 3rd. Arpin, we are only a few days away from the trade deadline, so it's going to take the bulk of our discussion today. But it's ironic because, we're recording this prior to the game against the Buffalo Sabres. And a lot of people will say, well, if they manage to squeeze, 5 games in a row, if they win 5 games in a row, then it might alter the plan. But somehow I'm thinking one game should not decide in which direction this management is going to go, as if they're going to be sellers or buyers or status quo on Friday, no?
No, it's not. And it's been their play since the return from the break. But we've talked about this before. The management's determination of what this team is about was made prior to the break and the way they entered the break. And that really cemented how management was going to approach this deadline. I don't think that's changed. What has changed is I think the Canadiens have made it easier for management to really stick to their prices and not budge. Yeah. They've made it easier to stand pat and be like, whatever, let's just keep our guys and that's that. If you're not willing to pay a first round pick for Evans and Armia, then we're just going to keep Evans and Armia. If you're not willing to pay a second for Evans, then we're just going to keep like that calculus has been made easier and made easier to justify, frankly, by looking at the standings and seeing that the Canadiens are exactly where they hoped to be when the season began, which is trademark hashtag in the mix, and they're in that mix. And so it's March. They want to play meaningful games in March. They're playing meaningful games in March. Everything they hope to do this season, they are doing, despite that terrible stretch when the pressure got higher and the Canadiens fell on their faces, as we mentioned in the last episode. Nick Suzuki saying so.
Yeah.
But the Canadiens being where they're at, you mentioned on the last episode, we bickered about it on the last episode about how Nick Suzuki says, I hate seeing guys, I'm getting sick of seeing guys leave at the deadline, blah, 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 which is true. He has said that, and he said it at the golf tournament this year. It's been his mantra, that he doesn't want. So what he said at the golf tournament, just to be clear. So we've traded away guys at deadlines that got us more draft picks and prospects. I think in that way, we're pretty fully stocked in prospects and picks. So I think the position that we're in now is we're really trying to make the playoffs and show what kind of team we are. Have they shown what kind of team they are? Probably not, but they have shown that they are a team that they don't need to necessarily give up on, that there are pieces of this team that could be long-term core pieces that are moving in the right direction, And so does that change meaningfully the way Ken Hughes and Jeff Gorton will look at the market between now and Friday? Probably not, but they do have to manage what you mentioned last episode. And so I asked Nick about that on Monday morning, how would you feel if despite all these won games, people still left at the deadline the way they have each of the last 3 years? And he was like, well, I'd be disappointed. Obviously, I don't want that. But this was the interesting part was, I was like, do you feel comfortable going to management with that? Do you feel comfortable going to Kent or Jeff or both and be like, I will be disappointed if you move guys off this team? He's like, yeah. I was like, have you done that? He's like, yeah, kind of. And I was like, okay. And then I was just like, well, what was the response? And he just said, the response was win some games. And then he walked away. And so...
Well, that's the thing, because right now they're winning some games. I find it a bit unusual and to a certain extent unfortunate when you look at their schedule, the type of opponents that they're beating. Because yeah, sure, you got teams like Buffalo and San Jose, teams that you should beat if you want to stay in the hunt. So far, the Canadiens lately, they've done what they had to do to stay in the hunt or to come back in the hunt in that sense by beating such teams. But at the same time, you can say, oh, they're in a position tonight on Monday night to win their 5th game in a row. But the fact that it's happened mostly against lesser opponents, to me, it doesn't help management having a proper read or, well, they've made a read before.
The read's done.
The read is done. But to trust that this current momentum means something and that say, oh, for example, when they had their winning stretch around the new year, when they went out, in Florida, the
beat all the latest cup winners on the road.
Yeah, and they beat all sorts of good teams, Colorado and all that. That was a message that was sent. This is not necessarily where we are, but this is definitely what we could be. And there was a statement. If there was a stretch of games that happened at this time of the year, I think that it would have probably a bigger sway into trusting that group that they're going to keep that momentum going for the rest of the season, because mathematically they're not that far. I mean, they got two points out of the gap that was separating them from a playoff spot, going from 6 to 4. It took them 4 wins in a row to manage to
Why do you keep saying 4 when they're 3 points back in Detroit?
Because 3 makes you on par with the Red Wings. But the Red Wings, yeah, that's it. But you're not past the Red Wings in the current.
Well, they could be. If they had more regulation wins off those 3 points, they would be.
Right now, if they want to pass Detroit, they need 1 more point than Detroit. So you would be
okay. Well, the regulation win counter would be different if they made up the 3-point gap with Detroit. So it's like they would have more regulation wins, presumably, if they made up a 3-point gap with Detroit, which would give them the tiebreaker.
They have
1 fewer regulation win than Detroit. They're 3 points back. You got to. Anyhow, I'm saying they're 3 points back in the playoffs because if they get even with Detroit, they could be ahead in regulation wins by then. It's not inconceivable. It depends on how things go, but anyhow.
Okay, so let's make it 3. It was 4. It was 4 yesterday or the day before yesterday when I kept with that because that was anyway. But gosh, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, my point is that
they've shaved the gap since the return from the break.
Slightly, but it took 4 games, 4 wins in a row in order to do that. So it's quite a commitment to hope that they're going to be able to continue in that way. And had they won against tougher opponents, I feel that the message would have been stronger. I'm not sure, even if they win tonight against Buffalo, that this is going to be any more persuasive to convince the management to turn the tide.
It's not. There's no question about it. And even if they'd beaten the 4 best teams in the league coming out of the break, it would not have been persuasive to management. Like, it wouldn't have changed their overall outlook. The key thing that Ken Hughes keeps saying that people need to keep in mind is sustainable winning.
Mm-hmm.
What they want is sustainable winning, but they also want that the young players who will be part of that sustainable winning to experience something they haven't experienced, a playoff race, meaningful games, pressurized games. And the reality is that the first time they faced those pressurized games, which was coming off of that great winning stretch and being actually in a playoff spot, they wilted and fell apart. So that went into the evaluation of sustainable winning. Like, it's just not. It didn't look like a team that was worth investing in, and didn't look like a team that was just on the cusp of being a sustainable winner. But to me, it's not the quality of the teams that they beat. It's really the fact that it's all coming a little too late. But it's on the Canadiens, because at some point the pendulum's going to swing. And according to Tankathon, the Canadiens have the 20th hardest or 12th easiest schedule in the NHL from now until the end. The top of that list is Detroit. Second is the Rangers. Fourth is the Islanders. Fifth is Columbus. So all these teams that the Canadiens are chasing for a playoff spot, Ottawa's closer to where Montreal is in terms of strength of schedule. It's actually a little bit easier. Boston's a tiny bit easier. But, we talked in the last episode about the injuries in Boston. Yeah. Rangers just traded Ryan Lindgren. Yes, they got Calvin DeHaan back, but that was sort of a soft sell. It's there are pathways. None of these teams are perfect. In fact, they're all very imperfect. And so getting to the playoff spot is not outside the realm of possibility. I don't think that's going to influence Jeff Gorton and Ken Hughes in any way, in any meaningful way. If they get their price on the players that they're offering, they're going to move those players. But it definitely makes it easier for Ken Hughes to step to that table on Friday in Brossard after the deadline has passed and say the prices we were offered weren't good enough. The team has shown us something. We decided to stick with what we've got. And if we were to do that, it would make Nick Suzuki happy, Cole Caulfield happy. All the guys who have lived through this whole process would see that as validation of what they've done since the return from the break, no matter the quality of the opponents, because, they could have come out, like Vancouver has, for instance, or like a bunch of teams where they just continued falling apart and something needed to flip, and it seems to have. But yeah, the one thing I didn't ask Suzuki is when he had that conversation with management, because if he had that conversation with management over the break, which I would imagine is when it happened, but I can't say that for sure. But that'd be quite a response if your GM tells you to go out and win some games and they reel off 4 in a row and he's got 9 points in those 4 games, like that's a pretty good response. That would be a good narrative. But I didn't do my job and didn't ask him when he had that conversation. So he did have one. Didn't really want to fully admit it, but he did have one, and so that's been expressed to management that their captain would like them to not touch his team.
Yeah,
which is no surprise.